Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm an Old Norse specialist teaching at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Today, what I want to talk about is who the Norse gods and goddesses are, as best as we can tell from the actual Old Norse sources. I'm not talking about 19th, 20th, 21st century books or websites, but rather going back to the original sources of these stories and then drawing from that what we can know about the gods and goddesses. So, to begin with, let me remind you real quick that the spellings of names that I show on the screen here are the Old Norse spellings, not the modern Icelandic spellings, and the pronunciation of names that I use is the Old Norse pronunciation as reconstructed by linguists such as myself. The language is actually very well known to us, the pronunciation reasonably well assured by several different veins of reconstruction by historical linguists, and so I don't think there's any harm in using the reconstructed pronunciation rather than the modern Icelandic pronunciation that's become so popular in the last couple of decades by people who teach Old Norse. So there are two families of the gods that these texts tell us about. There's the Æsir and the Vanir. The Æsir seem to be somewhat more dominant, while the Vanir seem to be more subordinate. And the Vanir also seem to have some more association with fertility and agriculture, the natural world. Njordr is the most senior of the Vanir. He's often called the god of the sea, but we have to be careful about those labels in Norse mythology. Often the gods are more personalities than they are simply functions. And the functions that we assign to them today based on a story or two or a hint or two often oversimplify their role and are really usable and should be used only as sort of mnemonics for us to remember who these gods are. Njordr slept with an unnamed sister to produce his son and daughter, Þórr and Froya. Þórr, often called the god of agriculture and fertility, and Froya, often called the goddess of love. And their names literally mean Lord and Lady, Þórr and Froya. They're related to the German word Frau, meaning lady originally, now more or less just woman. But so these are probably not originally their names, rather titles for them. Possibly Froyar's original name was Yngvi, he's sometimes called that, and Froya may perhaps be the same person as Frigg, the wife of Óðinn. Frigg means love, in spite of what it might sound like to English speakers, and Froya is said now and then to be married to Óðr, which is simply another form of the name Óðinn, and very unlikely to be a different person, given how much Óðinn disguises himself and changes his name. Njordr is married to Skadi. Skadi was originally a giant, as was Froyar's wife, Gerður. But once they have married into the gods, these giant women become considered goddesses. So we have to remember that the giants are not a different species from the gods. They're simply a family, often a rival family, but sometimes a family that interbreeds with the gods as well. And so much like a woman might assume a new last name when she marries a man, the giant women assume the title of goddess, whether Vanir or Æsir, if they happen to marry one of the gods, and they are no longer considered giant women. So they're not a separate species, they're not giant blue people. Another god sometimes considered one of the Vanir, at least according to the poem Þrymskvida in the Poetic Edda, is Heimdallr, who is the guardian of the gods. We know that Heimdallr is the son of 9 sisters, but we don't know what that means. And we know that he has fantastic sight and hearing, and that he is ever watchful for Ragnarok, the final battle in which the gods will be killed. He will announce the coming of Ragnarok by blowing his great horn, Gjallarhorn. Now, among the Æsir, the chief god is Óðinn. Óðinn's name means the mad one, same ambiguity in English as in Old Norse, the crazy one or the angry one, and either one is appropriate to him. He is a very anxious figure, which is not always suggested by the way he's depicted in popular media. Óðinn is anxious because he knows that he and the rest of the gods will die at Ragnarok. Specifically, Óðinn knows he will be swallowed by the great wolf Fenrir. And so, in order to try to forestall the events of Ragnarok, he is trying to build up the greatest army that he can. And he does this by sending his Valkyries, and these are also not a separate species, but rather human or giant women who are granted the powers of a Valkyrie, down to battlefields to take warriors who die in battle to Óðinn in his hall in Valhall. Now notice both these words, Valkyrie, which in Old Norse is Valkyria, and Valhall have that first element, Val. Now, Val means a dead body on the battlefield. In English, it's often translated slain, which is a good translation for it. So the Valkyria is the chooser of the slain, and Valhall is the hall of the slain. Now, in Valhall, these dead warriors will fight and kill one another all day, every day, being resurrected in the evening to have a feast together. And what they're doing is training up for Ragnarok. And so Óðinn will also often wander the earth in disguise in order to stir up battle and get men to kill one another. And Óðinn, in his normal appearance, is an old man with one eye. He is fond of wide-brimmed hats and the color gray and spears or staffs. And he disguises himself as an old man, dressed usually in gray, often in a wide-brimmed hat with a staff or spear and one eye. And yet somehow no one ever knows it's him. And he'll always give a name that's a little bit suggestive of his role or his appearance. So he'll call himself Bolverker, evildoer, or Horbarður, gray hair, gray beard. Well, in the story in which he takes the name Bolverker, which is told by Snorri in his Prose Edda, Óðinn, or Bolverker, wanders past a field where 9 men are mowing with scythes. Óðinn approaches these 9 men and offers to sharpen their scythes with his whetstone. And after he's done so, the men ask if they can buy this excellent whetstone. And he says, sure, essentially whoever is still alive when it comes down to the ground can have it. He throws it up in the air. The 9 men kill one another. He catches his stone and he walks along his merry way on his way to go get the meat of poetry, according to this story that Snorri retells. So Óðinn is happy. He's got 9 more men who have killed each other fighting, and they're going to join his army in Valhall. So he's a very ambiguous figure in a way, because even though he is leading the side of good against the giants and monsters at Ragnarok, he is at the same time not necessarily going to help you lead a long and happy life. If he can get his way, he's going to harvest you when you are still at your top fighting prowess. Óðinn is married to Frigg, and Óðinn and Frigg have a famous son, Baldur, who is mostly famous for being beautiful and for being killed when his blind brother Þórr is tricked into killing him by the trickster figure Loki. Þórr may not be Frigg's son. His mother hasn't specified, but he probably is based on his relationship with Baldur and that story. Óðinn has most of his children with women other than Frigg. His most famous son is with Jörð, literally earth, and that is his son Þór. Thor is quite different from Óðinn. Thor is he's a fighter, but he's not there's no hint of selfishness in his fighting. He is a defender both of Ósgarður, the gods' enclosure where they live, and of Miðgarður, the middle enclosure where we humans live. And to protect us, he uses his hammer Mjolnir, which has the power not only to break anything that it touches, but Thor can also throw it any distance and have it return to him, and it can even shrink down to the size of a small amulet so that he can disguise himself as just a regular metalhead. Thor has a wife named Siv, and with both Siv and various giant women, who he is otherwise quite busy killing, he has children, including his daughter Þrúður, strength, his son Magni, strength, and his son Móði, basically wrath. Another important member of the Aesir family is Tyr. Tyr is the one-handed god, just as Óðinn is the one-eyed god. Tyr lost his hand when the wolf Fenrir was being bound up by the gods who knew that he was prophesied to kill Óðinn at Ragnarok. And Fenrir had to be tricked into putting on a chain that would actually bind him permanently. But he was suspicious, and he said that one of the gods had to put his hand in his mouth so that Fenrir could bite it off, just in case the chain actually would bind him up forever. And the only one who was honest enough to do that was Tyr, so he lost his hand. Unfortunately, we don't know much more about Tyr beyond that story, other than that his father, Hymir, is a giant, again reminding us that the giants and gods are different families, sometimes rivals, sometimes tense friends rather than different species. Now, one of the most interesting figures who's at the intersection of giant and god is Loki. Loki is often called the trickster. I'm not sure that that term actually very well captures exactly how he behaves in most of these poems. At any rate, Loki is the son of a figure named Þórr and a woman, Laufey. Snorri says Þórr is a giant and Laufey is a goddess. Keep in mind, Laufey is not his dad, but his mom. That is something that is often misrepresented in popular culture, probably because Loki is often called Laufey, our son of Laufey, but more often men are called son of their father than their mother. Loki is married to Sigyn, but his most famous children are with the giant woman Angrboda. His children with her include Fenrir, the wolf that bit off Tyr's hand and will eventually kill Óðinn, the serpent or dragon that encircles Midgarðr, where human beings live. This dragon is either called Midgardsormur, literally Midgard's serpent, or sometimes Jormungandr, monstrous being, monstrous beast. Neither one is a name, but more of a description of it. And then there is Hel, the half living and half blue as a corpse woman who rules over Hel, the realm of the dead, who don't go to Valhalla. Loki also can literally become female rather than simply pure female. He can become even another species female. He becomes a mare at one point and is impregnated by the horse Svadilfuri and gives birth to the stallion Sleipnir, which is the 8-legged stallion of Óðinn. Now, the giants, to talk about them a little bit more. Again, they're not a different species. They're not giant blue things. In fact, giant isn't even a very good translation for what they're called in Old Norse, which is either Jotun or Thors. Jotun seems to be the more neutral word. Thor seems to be a word that implies more evil, more destruction. And very rarely in Old Norse, but more in modern folklore, you'll see the word troll. When that's used in Old Norse, it seems to imply a particularly ugly giant, but then some of the giants are said to be very beautiful. Among the giants, there seems to be perhaps a distinct kind called the Hrimthurs. This is frost giant. It's possible this isn't actually intended to be a different kind, but this is just a word that's used when we need alliteration with an H, as Old Norse poetry is strongly alliterative, and there are many alternative names for many different creatures. But the Hrimthursar, if they are a distinct class of giants, are the earliest living beings in Norse myth, because among their number is the very first living thing, Ymir. Óðinn's mother is a giant, Bestla. She is the daughter of Bolthorn, another giant, and she is married to Bor, who is one of the descendants of the earliest, well, one of the other earliest living beings, the earliest one in the Asir line, Buri, who is licked out of a block of ice by Audhumla, the first cow. Now, if you read Snorri or read certain handbooks or websites about Norse myth, you'll also find the names of many other gods and goddesses. For example, reading Snorri, you might encounter goddess names like Sjóvin, which he says is a goddess of love, Lofin, which he says is another goddess of love, or Hlin, which he says is a goddess of protection. It is unlikely these actually were separate goddesses that were believed in Old Norse times. They are probably alternative names for Frigg and Froya used in poetry when that particular name would fit the needs of the alliteration or rhyme in a given poem. There is no independent evidence for these goddesses aside from Snorri making a list of them, and Snorri always wants to have a list of 12 goddesses or 12 gods, and since there aren't that many goddesses mentioned, he fills out the list with a lot of these alternative names for Frigg and Froya. There are some other gods and goddesses that clearly were legitimate parts of Viking Age belief that we just don't know much about. There's Ullr, who seems to have been a very powerful god early on in Norse belief, but to have lost a lot of his portfolio as the Viking Age progressed. He's a very shadowy figure associated vaguely with oaths in some poems of the Poetic Edda. There's Gefjon, a goddess. There is Fulla, a goddess who is the servant of Frigg. And there's Þórr, a goddess who protects wedding vows. But beyond that, there are not many other gods and goddesses that we can point to as definitely having been part of the mythological traditions that survive from the Viking Age. Now, our two major sources that survive from the Middle Ages are two books called Edda, written in Iceland in the 1200s. One of these is the Poetic Edda. This is a compilation of different poems, each one of which is a different topic about the Norse gods or about some of the legendary Norse heroes. The poems are not necessarily related to each other, much like the books of the Bible aren't necessarily related to each other in what they talk about. They don't necessarily tell one single narrative that begins in one poem and ends in another one. Each one has a particular focus. So for instance, the poem Völuspá tells about the creation and destruction of the world. Hávamál tells of Odin's wisdom as well as his sacrifice of himself to himself. Lokasenna tells of Loki insulting all of the gods at a feast. There's also the Prose Edda. Now, the Prose Edda is the work of one particular author, Snorri Sturluson. Now, Snorri was born in 1178 or 1179 and died in 1241. He was an Icelandic chieftain, and the reason he wrote the Prose Edda was originally to instruct the current generation of Icelanders to compose traditional Old Norse poetry rather than the increasingly popular English or French styles of poetry that were leaking into Scandinavia at the time. But in order to instruct people in writing this very complex form of poetry, which often makes allusions and references to the myths, Snorri had to retell many of those myths. And it's clear that he knew many of the poems in the Poetic Edda, sometimes in slightly different versions than the ones that actually were preserved in the manuscript of the Poetic Edda, the Codex Regius. And he often quotes poems that aren't in the Poetic Edda too, so sometimes he's our only source for certain stories. And we have to keep in mind that in spite of the fact that the writing of these books is being done in the 1200s, that doesn't mean that the stories are only as old as the 1200s. So poetry can actually survive relatively unchanged for a pretty long period of time. And there's linguistic evidence that many poems in the Poetic Edda actually date from many centuries before the 1200s when they were written down. So in spite of the somewhat popular claim on some websites that Norse mythology was basically made up in the 1200s by Christians, that's not true. Christian scholars wrote down what they knew of the Norse myths in the 1200s, and as far as we can tell, they did an honest effort at recording the stories that they did know. Keep in mind, of course, that is just stories. They didn't transmit anything about how to worship these gods, right? We know very little about prayer or religion as far as the Norse religion went. We know their stories, their mythology. I hope that if you enjoy this presentation that you will check out the primary sources. I do recommend the translation of the Prose Edda by Anthony Falks, and I recommend my own translation of the Poetic Edda, which is designed to be more readable and to encapsulate my own understanding of the text, having studied it for many years and taught it for many years at many universities, both in classes in Old Norse and in English. I also have a Patreon page if you want to help me continue to make these free videos. And for now, I will wish you all the very best from beautiful Colorado.